I'm standing by the sea and it's nice and calm, but look, there's a storm coming. And that's what I hear every single day from the financial markets. Recession, high interest rates, all these words that you think, ooh, I'm starting to feel a little bit anxious. I'm going to talk to Andrew Kelleher today from JMI Wealth about the big picture, how it affects us and how we can have financial well-being. Andrew, thank you, mate.
My pleasure, JK.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
really excited about today. We're old surfers from way back, but
yeah, failing surfers these days.
Failing
surfers, yeah. Slowing down.
The Grey Brigade. But really excited about today because financial well-being is something that's really, really important to us at Groove. You know, I interviewed 3,000 people before we started Groove, and financial troubles, concerns was a big part of their lives. And I think right now there seems to be this negativity and the storm coming. So what's a recession, mate?
What's a recession? Well, you're seeing it a lot in the newspapers, aren't you? You know, and you're seeing it a lot in the media. A recession, look, there's a technical definition of a recession, and the technical definition is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Now, that just doesn't mean a lot to people, but when we try and sort of measure what's happening in the economy, we refer to growth, and that's kind of like the sum of all of the activity that's going on. And generally we see economies just tend to grow at a fairly sort of slow and sedate rate, and that's kind of cool. That's what we want to see. Every now and then though, things turn a little bit and go backwards. And if you get 2 quarters when that, what we call GDP, gross domestic product, a big word, right? But that's just a measure of all the economic activity that's happening all around us. If that goes backwards for 2 quarters, that's called a recession. Now, the funny thing about a recession is you don't actually know you're in one until we actually well into it, because we don't report growth until sort of quite a way after the quarter. So to get 2 quarters, by the time you find out, it's probably 8 months after the recession started. But what it actually is you feel the economy slowing down around you, and you do get a lot of negative stuff in the press, and I think that's what a lot of people kind of respond to. So yeah, that's the technical definition.
Why is interest rates and inflation, when you like these 3 things come, right?
Yep.
People talk about recession,
Yeah.
and then inflation's going to go up, so we're going to raise the interest rate. So why are they correlated?
Yeah, well, so I mean, everything's related, right? Everything, and economically, everything sort of, you push one lever and you pull another lever, and everything is kind of connected. Recessions, the things that happen with recessions, actually let's just take a step back. And what we generally see is we see economic cycles, okay? And so economic cycles, you get a bit of growth and the economies go really well, and then things get a little bit overheated and you sort of top out, and then you go down the other side and you start to get heading towards that recession, and you get a trough. Okay, and that's kind of where we're heading at the moment. Now, all recessions are different. All economic cycles are different. So that's the first thing. So we often say, and you'll often hear that term, that history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it does rhyme. And so you tend to see that same sort of cycle. And the way that interest rates can sort of respond to that economic cycle, and this time they definitely have. So we saw interest rates, actually, you're living in a crazy time at the moment. I mean, if you want to know, you're part of history right now, because we've been part of the biggest move that we've seen in interest rates in sort of probably 100 years. Interest rates topped out when you and I were buying our first houses. You remember that? Back in the late 80s, and interest rates were really high, 18, 19%. But for the last 40 years, interest rates have sort of fallen. They've just got lower and they got lower. There's been a few wobbles along the way. They got lower and lower. Then 2022 came along. And 2022 was one out of the bag. And I've had to sort of actually go out and talk to financial advisors about this as well. But 2022 was a sort of a signature year, because all of a sudden, that 40-year move in interest rates came to a halt, and they started going back up again. Now, it kind of needed to happen, because you may remember that when we sort of went through COVID and governments threw money into the economy and the central bankers threw money into the economy, and all of a sudden we ended up with something that I have not seen in my 35 years of dealing with, dealing with financial markets, and that was negative interest rates, which just doesn't make sense. I couldn't get my head around it. So interest rates got so low that in Europe, in certain parts of Europe and Switzerland and other places, interest rates were below zero. Now, we're not even going to go there because that's just too hard. So they could only really go one way, and that was back up. But the speed with which they went back up in 2022 was profound. That was the biggest and fastest move we've seen in interest rates in probably 50 years. So it was a heck of a year. And I think that's what really got people's focus back onto interest rates, because all of a sudden they had this mortgage that they'd got and it was great. It was at 2%, and then bloody hell, they're now refixing it at 6%. So people start talking about interest rates. Interest rates was part of this cycle, because that lowering of interest rates that we saw, particularly post-COVID, just threw all these other assets out of kind of whack. Why wouldn't you buy a house if your mortgage rate was at 2%? Why wouldn't you buy money was basically free. So companies were hiring people left, right, and centre. They were doing stuff left, right, and centre. Why? Because it was cheap. It was cheap for them to fund it, but it couldn't last forever. That party had to come to an end, but it came to an end really fast in 2022.
I think most people's stress is, will it go much higher? Right? So you adjust to it and you go, okay, I'm not going to go out for dinner. Yep. Little things like that you need to sacrifice. But I guess the biggest fear is, could they keep going north?
So I'll go out on a bit of a limb here and say right now, and we're talking in sort of April, 2023. I don't think they go a heck of a lot higher. I'm involved in the financial markets on a day-to-day basis, so we look at this thing in very detailed level. In New Zealand, for instance, at the moment, you've got, the central rate, which we call the official cash rate, is at 5.25. The genius that are the financial markets, and sometimes you've got to call that genius into question because regularly get things wrong, but it's suggesting that 5.5 is probably the top. If you go to the elephant economy in the world, if you look at the US, they're probably within 0.25% of the peak of their cash rate. That's assuming that some of this slowing down that we're seeing in the labour market, some of the slowing down that we're seeing in spending, that gets bedded in, then probably interest rates don't go an awful lot higher. The only note of caution that I would give is that the central bankers around the world are determined not to repeat the errors that we saw last time inflation was really high. That was back in the 70s, and they kind of got it wrong. And what could have been a sort of an economic cycle that would have lasted 5 years, lasted about 10. And it led to a pretty significant recession in the early 80s.
What were the mistakes?
They took their foot off the monetary policy pedal early, okay?
Which means?
So what that means is they were putting the interest rates up, they're putting the interest rates up, they're putting the interest rates up, and then they thought, yeah, I think we've done enough. And so they then had a pause, and then they started lowering the interest rate. Trouble is they went a little bit too early. So I think this time around, you've got a lot of people that have studied what happened in the 70s. This time around, I don't think they're going to let up early. So that's the first thing. And we saw that very recently in New Zealand, where we thought cash rate was going to go up by 0.25%, went up by 0.5%. And that was sort of the Reserve Bank governor of New Zealand saying, we are going to get tough on inflation and we are going to kill it. We are going to win that battle. So I think the one thing that I would caution is that interest rates could stay the sort of levels we're seeing now for a little bit longer than people think, until the central bankers are absolutely sure that we've stopped spending.
So the official cash rate.
The official cash rate, yes.
Tell me about that. Why I keep hearing about it, what it is exactly and how it affects me.
Okay, so there's sort of two answers to that question. The official cash rate is really quite a technical thing. And it's, if you're a bank, let's say let's go into an alternate universe, shall we, JK? And then we've got JK Bank, okay? So we've got ASB, we've got the BNZ, we've got JK Bank. You've got people putting money into your bank and you've got your lending people out. But at the end of every day, you've actually got probably some excess money in your bank, okay? What do you do with that? Well, what all the banks do is they give it to the Reserve Bank, okay? And the Reserve Bank pays you a certain rate on that. They pay you the official cash rate, okay? So that's kind of the default rate that the bank gets from the banks get from the excess money they have. That's the technical side of it. How it affects you and me, though, is the banks use that rate to then set interest rates out there.
So I give you $1.
Yep.
You're now the.
Am I AK Bank now?
Yeah, no, you're the government. You're the Reserve Bank.
I'm the Reserve Bank.
I come to you. I give you $100, and you say, for that $100, I'm going to give you 1.5% interest.
Or, well, whatever the official cash rate
Whatever
is.
the official cash rate is.
They'll give you that.
And then with that, I come back out and say, well, okay, JK needs a mortgage, so I'm going to whack 3% on top of that. That's
whatever
margin.
your margin happens to be. So the bank.
So as the cash rates go up, the banks.
You got it.
Obviously, don't narrow down their.
Oh no, well, no, they don't.
They'll keep their percentage up. So
that's exactly it. So it's sort of like that's the sort of tide mark, right? So as the official cash rate goes up and down, all the other interest rates in the economy move around as well. The only sort of slight, some people at home will be pointing out to me now, is that fixed mortgage rates, so like a 2-year rate or a 3-year rate, they sort of move around on where the wholesale rates are out in the wholesale market. But all of those rates get affected by the official cash rate. The problem you've got here is that it's quite a blunt tool. So if you think about, and when I talked before about
blunt, it's a punch in the nose, because if your interest rates go from 3 to 6% in 3 months, it's not a blunt tool, it's a punch in the nose if you're a young family.
The thing is that it's to try and, the Reserve Bank is trying to manage a whole lot of different factors. So it's trying to manage what's happening in the labour market, okay? Now, so if you think of, I'm trying to move around what's happening in the labour market, and all I've got is this one tool here, the official cash rate, it takes quite a long time when they move that cash rate for that to feed through to ABC builders over there.
What sort of advice would you give to your son right now? I know that your kids are similar age to mine. Yep. What sort of advice would you give to them? I don't believe they're married, but if they were married and say had a couple of kids, so you talk to your young son who's 27, not married, you talk to your 30-year-old who's married with a couple of kids, what would you actually practically say to them?
I think you've got to make sure you've got a plan. I know this is boring, and I know this is kind of, not what an exciting young hip person wants to hear, but having a bit of a plan is not a bad idea. And the thing you've got to remember at that age is you've got a lot of time in front of you, and so making really small changes now can actually have quite a big effect over time, because you've got 20 or 30 years to be able to get to where you want to get to. You've got to sit down and talk to each other, talk to your partner, talk to whoever is actually involved in the outcome there. You've got to sit down and talk to each other, because generally there's a way out of all these things, and they won't last. The situation won't last forever. It's really important to have good communication. And there are so many tools these days that you can use. The banks have got tools where you can go and you can have a little look at your spending and work out. You can drop it down onto an Excel spreadsheet, or even just write down, well, this is what our spending has been, and look, maybe we can just do a little bit of belt tightening, and we can figure that out. Try and have a common goal if there is more than one of you. If you're by yourself, okay, well, maybe find a friend to have a conversation with, or a relative, because not everybody has that other person. So but having the conversation, I think you'd be a big believer in this. Having that conversation actually gets it out there, makes you feel a little bit better, possibly find solutions. And if you haven't got someone, in your life that you can have that conversation with, then somebody at the bank would have a chat to you. If that's too hard if you don't want to go there, there are other places. there are budgeting services, Citizens Advice Bureau. You can go and have a chat with them. But I think talking about it, acknowledging the problem, that's the key.
Well, that is mental health, right?
Yep.
I'll leave the science to Dr. Fiona Crichton, who's amazing, but she often talks about externalizing the problem,
correct,
halves it,
yep.
And you get a bit of a plan around it.
Yep.
So how many recessions have you been through?
Oh gosh, look, honestly, I couldn't tell you, but there's been quite a few. And if you think about it, I'm getting quite old now. The thing is, they all finish. Some of them last a little bit longer than others, but generally, what we said before, by the time somebody tells you, oh, look, we're in a recession, you've probably been in it for 8 months and you may not have noticed. So they don't last forever. You do come out the other side, and then the good times happen again. And so I think, don't get too caught up. Your life probably won't change an awful lot because you're in a recession. And they do finish and they do end, and then things get better.
Been a real pleasure, mate. Thank you for your time. Loved it.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it.